Hey guys, welcome back to CLOWNFISH TV. This is Kneon. We're going to talk about Rooster Teeth. More bad news associated with Rooster Teeth. More indication that Warner Brothers, Warner Media could be paring back more on Rooster Teeth and Crunchyroll. And we're going to talk about that. But we're also going to talk about the fact that a lot of these anime and comic book blogs are not giving us any potentially negative news regarding certain companies and certain individuals, but they have no problem writing multiple articles about people they don't like, which is very, very curious. Now, before we get into the video, I want to give a hat tip to Hirohei, our friend Hirohei, who actually covered this, I believe, in a video a couple of days ago. I didn't know anything about it because nobody's talking about it. Bounding Into Comics put an article up about it over the weekend, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about Crunchyroll Expo. And then I'm going to talk about how more and more it does seem like a lot of these blogs are very selective in what they cover. Now, in our case, we are a very small YouTube channel. It is mostly just Geeky and I working out of part of our house, recording a couple of videos on things that interest us every day. You know, we get people who are like, why didn't you cover this? Why didn't you cover that? Why didn't you? It's because we don't have a news staff. We don't have a newsroom. We're just a couple who are into anime and into pop culture, into comic books, and we just give our opinions on things as we have time throughout the day. And we're not a newsroom, but you've got fully staffed newsrooms at these pop culture sites that I believe are deliberately turning a blind eye to news that would make people within their group look bad. That is my opinion. That is an opinion. So before we get into the video, please subscribe to the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, we passed 80,000 subs this week. Thank you very much for that. We're hoping for 100,000 soon. Want to keep bringing you guys our news and opinions. We do have a lot of opinions on the news. And you guys have been great this year. Last couple months especially, we've exploded. So thank you for that. This article coming from Bounding Into Comics. And again, I said Hirohei covered this a couple of days ago. Didn't get to watch all of his video, but it was news to me. I hadn't heard anything about it. So I'll put a link to Hirohei's video in the description. Rooster Teeth to close Australian online store, citing high costs and low demand for product. Low demand for product. That's not a good sign. Rooster Teeth, the popular internet media company behind such popular web series as Red vs. Blue and RWBY, has recently announced that they will be shuttering the doors on their Australian web store, with Rooster Teeth claiming that it had become increasingly more difficult and expensive to sustain an Australian store. Again, Warner Brothers, you know, they're looking to cut corners. They really cut corners with Rooster Teeth this year. They laid a bunch of people off. There was a huge management change. The only reason there's a second season of Genlock, as I understand it, is because HBO is picking up the tab for it. Rooster Teeth is not in a good place right now. Financially, they're not in a good place right now. We have had several former and current Rooster Teeth employees come to us behind the scenes saying that it's a lot worse than what you're seeing publicly, which I believe. And they were actually coming to us saying that there were rounds of layoffs in the spring that nobody talked about. And, you know, all of this goes back to a combination of Warner Media cutting back on all of these you know, studios, internet divisions. We saw it happen with Cartoon Network. You know, they cut Christine Miller from Cartoon Network. They said she left on her own. I think she got cut. And yeah, they're definitely paring down their operations when it comes to animated content, in my opinion. So in the November 27th blog post, video game and anime merchandise fulfillment house Hanabi Entertainment, the company responsible for handling the Australian Rooster Teeth store, announced that Rooster Teeth had slowly grown to be their biggest client, and Hanabi Entertainment could no longer meet their demands, and the two companies would be untying their relationship. After all this time in these projects, we found our team was getting more and more focused on Rooster Teeth, who became our biggest client. I took on a new project with them in the UK, and the team took over the responsibilities in Australia, embracing the chaos. It became clear over the last year that Rooster Teeth's global growth would lead to a crossroads. The merchandise team is world-class, and they started pumping out a range of products as fast as Zara. Even Amazon struggles to keep up with the logistical demands. We fought like hell. Ultimately, the Australian store couldn't keep up, so the hard decision was made, and we started the process of untying Hanabi and Rooster Teeth's long-standing relationships. So, I mean, this sounds like they're actually selling too much Rooster Teeth product at first, but then you read between the lines and there's more going on here. So the store closes on December 16th. Now, Atkinson explained the partnership was no longer sustainable due to a combination of the increased production volume and quality of products, high shipping costs, and local import taxes, and most importantly of all, the lower demand for the products. That's interesting because it sounded like they were saying they had too much. They were selling too much and they couldn't keep up. I've actually never heard of that. I've never heard of a company selling too much that they actually just, gave up the license or get whatever. So there's definitely more going on here. So it has become increasingly more difficult and expensive to sustain the Australian store. The cost of shipping and duties to get merch to Australia had become as much as the cost of the products themselves. I'm going to interject here and say that, yeah, this is probably true. As someone who has shipped books and stuff to Australia, I can tell you that the shipping is crazy expensive. It's crazy expensive. In fact, from the US to Australia, it's probably the most expensive shipping worldwide for us. And sometimes it does cost more than the merchandise. I'm going to be completely honest. I know people were complaining about, comic books and graphic novels costing a fortune to ship to other countries, but they do. They really do cost a fortune. That combined with a lower demand for the products, create a situation where we were losing money trying to provide a continuous supply of new merch to the store. This sucks, but we'll keep working on ways to improve how we support the community. They buried that in here. Yeah, like I said, companies like this, they just hire more people. They work it out. So basically what's going on is the merchandise isn't selling as well as it used to, and it's not worth it to them to keep shipping this stuff out because the cost of the shipping is too expensive. It's just not worth it anymore. It's not worth it for them to be in the Rooster Teeth business anymore. And I do think a lot of this is, part of the paring back that we've seen with Rooster Teeth over the last couple months. We're seeing something similar with Crunchyroll. This is being spun as a positive for Crunchyroll, but I don't really think it is. I think Warner Brothers is prepping the Crunchyroll Expo to turn into something else. And it's going to be outside of Crunchyroll's wheelhouse at that point, because we don't know what's going to happen to Crunchyroll. When HBO Max comes out next year, it's going to have a ton of anime on it, a ton of animated content on it. It's going to have the Studio Ghibli library on it. Crunchyroll's not getting that. And Crunchyroll might very well be looked at as a redundancy that Warner Media might pull the plug on in favor of pushing anime fans into just, biting the bullet and paying for HBO Max. That's a theory we've had. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. But knowing how Warner Media is right now, and if it were me, I probably would say, yeah, just go with HBO Max, because we're going to have all this anime plus a bunch of other stuff that probably would appeal to anime fans too, and then we just have one service we have to maintain. We're not having 5 or 6 different streaming services. But I digress. Yeah, RWBY is taking over. Basically taking over the Crunchyroll Expo as I understand it. It's still currently going to be branded as the Crunchyroll Expo for now. Now, I have heard good things about the people running it, and RWBY usually does put on a pretty good show. But it's interesting, again, that Warner Media is like, no, let's just give this to somebody else to handle, because we don't want to spend the money or the manpower or whatever to have our Crunchyroll people handling this. And this does look like, again, potentially supporting evidence that, Warner Media may decide to just shut down Crunchyroll, or shut it down as a separate streaming service, or just use it as a brand, as a tab on HBO Max, that here's our anime content via Crunchyroll. It's just a brand at this point. It's not an actual separate company. And this Crunchyroll Expo, maybe that just becomes, that's what Crunchyroll is. It's a brand that RWBY is taking over. Will they buy it out? There was a rumor going around that they were actually buying the Crunchyroll Expo out, and that does not appear to be the case. It appears that they're just being brought in to run it. But again, if you have long-term plans for your staff to be around and to be in the convention business long-term, why are you jobbing this convention out to another company? I think they're probably going to sell it at some point. That would be my guess. Again, this is all speculation. But Warner Media is divesting itself of anything that's not profitable at this point. Now, the interesting thing is this particular story, while it's not like earth-shattering news, it does show that the demand for Rooster Teeth product is slipping. That's pretty bad news. You know, even though it's just the Australian store, whatever, but this is a pattern. It's not just this story that wasn't on the radar with the anime sites like Anime News Network, or sites that cover anime like Comic Book Resources, comicbook.com, etc. You know, I was kind of like, well, why is nobody talking about this? And so I'm like, well, what's the other big Rooster Teeth story this month? And let's see if they're talking about that. Obviously, the biggest Rooster Teeth story in the last month has been that Rooster Teeth VP Michael Quinn was arrested after he beat his wife. He beat his wife. This is a huge story. This is a Rooster Teeth executive made all these headlines on mainstream nightly news outlets, even places that don't usually cover comic book news or anime news covered it. I mean, Rooster Teeth, it's all bad news, layoffs, etc., etc. And what you're not seeing on the news sites is they didn't cover anything on Michael Quinn that I'm aware of. A couple of outlets did. Anime News Network, I did a search. They never covered the Michael Quinn story, despite it being huge news. Now, they would cover, I mean, you could say, okay, well, they don't want to cover that because, you know, it's a pretty risque topic. It's, you know, whatever. And I get that, except for the fact that they couldn't stop talking about Vic Mignogna. Could they? Like, they couldn't stop. They loved it. They loved the Vic Mignogna stuff. They talked about lewd, alleged details, etc., etc. So Michael Quinn beating his wife, being a bigwig at Rooster Teeth, would actually be pretty newsworthy, I would think. Didn't talk about it. Comic Book Resources, as far as I can tell, they didn't talk about it either. But if you go out and you type in Vic Mignogna, Comic Book Resources was all over the Vic Mignogna thing. They were all over it. Here we go. They're on Twitter. You know, they're talking about that. I don't think they're talking about Michael Quinn. I can't find anything on Michael Quinn on Comic Book Resources or on Anime News Network. Yeah, so I mean, look, and again, this isn't to, you know, people are gonna be like, oh my God, you're pro Vic, you're defending that. No, I'm just pointing out here that they're very selective. These sites are very selective who they talk about, and which news is considered too lewd to be news. And we talked about this the other day. Now, I'm going to put a link out here to the Hannah partnership, by the way. But we talked about this the other day with Hope Nicholson. Hope Nicholson, who is pretty well known in independent Canadian comic book circles. She admitted to abusing a male comic book creator. She admitted to it, harassing him. She admitted to it, and she shut down her publisher, and she left Twitter, and nobody talked about it. Why didn't they talk about it? My personal opinion, we did another video on this. You can go out and find it. We talked about it, and like 2 smaller comic book blogs talked about it. It wasn't talked about because Hope Nicholson is, you know, one, it's a woman, but beyond that, you know, and it is kind of, you know, I'm going to say it, things, you know, men are treated differently in these kinds of cases, I believe, than women are. But beyond that, she's part of the group. Hope Nicholson is part of the indie comics clique. She's part of Club Comics, Canadian division, right? So she's part of the clique. They're not going to slam Hope Nicholson on the comic book blogs because they're just not going to. You know, it makes their side, I mean, I hate to be like us versus them, but it makes their side look bad when they're constantly talking about all the predators in comics and animation. And then it turns out that kind of one of their own is, you know, doing these sorts of things too. It kind of destroys the argument that it's all the bad guys, you know, when you've actually got people all across the board that are just garbage people. Michael Quinn being a VP of Rooster Teeth and being in multiple articles on sites that don't even cover anime news or animation news. You know, the fact that that it's not even talked about is weird. And again, very few people talking about Rooster Teeth closing the store down due to a lack of demand. Why would they not talk about it? They're not talking about it because it enforces the narrative, the story, the truth, as far as I'm concerned, that Rooster Teeth is in a really bad place right now. And Rooster Teeth is probably friends with people at these news outlets, or there are people from Rooster Teeth that are, or the news outlets are like, well, we can't throw any shade at Rooster Teeth because the pro-Vic people don't like Rooster Teeth right now. So we don't want the alt-right Yahtzees to think that we're not going to give them ammo. And that's really what I think it is. I think it's as simple as that. I think it's as simple as we don't want to give ammo to the alt-right Yahtzees, so we just won't talk about it. But at that point, it's like, well, you guys have a full newsroom. You have a full staff. You're not just YouTubers. You totally could cover this, but you're not. You're very selective in what you cover. And if it could potentially hurt friendships or relationships or whatever, they just tend to ignore it. And I'm sure if you look into it more and more and more, you'll find this. I mean, we talked about before all these 6-figure comic book crowdfunding campaigns on Indiegogo that nobody's talking about. They're not talking about them. Why are they not talking about them? This is big news. The biggest crowdfunding comic book campaigns this year have consistently been on Indiegogo, and the comic book blogs are not talking about it. Why aren't they? Very easy. They don't like the people running the campaigns. It's as simple as that. They don't like the people running the campaigns. They are YouTubers that they disagree with. They are people that they've demonized for the last 2 years, like Ethan Van Sciver, like Doug TenNapel. They don't like these guys, but they barely covered this either. Icarus and the Sun, which is done by a guy who I think he's doing work for DC right now. And he has nothing in this. He's not on YouTube as far as I'm aware of. He has a huge Instagram following. He did over $500,000, but they're not covering that on the comic book blogs either. So what I'm saying is the comic book news is very selective. The anime news is very selective, and it all depends on whether or not you are part of the club or if you're on the outside of it, whether or not you get any press. And this also determines the kind of coverage that you get. For example, Bleeding Cool did, as I recall, cover Doug TenNapel's Earthworm Jim campaign, which is a massive success. We had Doug on the show. Earthworm Jim is a very beloved 1990s video game character. It was a huge deal. The gaming press didn't cover it. The comic book blogs didn't cover it. We made almost $1 million and nobody talked about it. Nobody talked about it because they personally did not like Doug TenNapel, except for Bleeding Cool. I think Bleeding Cool talked about it, but they made sure at the very end of the article, they threw shade at Doug TenNapel because they didn't like him personally. They don't like his beliefs. They don't like some of the stuff he said on Twitter, etc., etc. So because of that, that person is no longer newsworthy, even if they are making news, even if they're smashing records. And these campaigns, in any other year, would have been a smashing success. And the comic book blogs would have crowed about, like, look, comics aren't dead. Look at these $1 million, Indiegogo campaigns. Look at the hundreds of thousands of dollars comic book creators are making on Indiegogo. But because they have relationships with people at Kickstarter, because their friends are only getting maybe $15,000, $20,000 on Kickstarter campaigns, and these people who they don't like are getting hundreds of thousands of dollars on campaigns, they refuse to talk about it. So the pop culture media is not reliable, at all. And it becomes more and more apparent. It has always been sort of selective, it's always been sort of a club, I guess, but it's never been more obvious than it has been the last 2 or 3 years that it definitely, absolutely, if you want press on any of these websites, the comic book resources and the Newsaramas and the Bleeding Cools and the Bleeding Cool, I actually will give the benefit of the doubt on, to be honest. I mean, I'm going to be fair on this. They actually do cover things that a lot of other outlets won't cover, but they're kind of on the, I think they're kind of on the outs with some of the publishers too, because they do dig up dirt sometimes. The publishers don't like that. But definitely Comic Book Resources has gotten very, very weird lately. We've talked about that. And it's all who you know. Anime News Network, we know what they're like. Now, again, to be fair, I think I talked about before, Mike Toole had blocked me on Twitter. I think Mike Toole actually unblocked me on Twitter. So if that is true, and I'll have to double check that because I saw a tweet of his about a month ago. If that is true, then I will absolutely give them credit for that too. The fan press is very gate-kept. It's very gate-kept at this point. So it's very interesting to see this. Very interesting to see that the bad news is not making it to some of these outlets, because I really think it's they want to play keep away. They don't want the YouTubers to signal boost anything bad. I really think that that's kind of what's going on here. But anyway, we'll talk later. Hey guys, thanks for watching Clownfish TV. Please consider supporting the channel. Go to clownfishsupport.com. That's clownfishsupport.com. And if you want to join our community, go to clownfishtalk.com. That's clownfishtalk.com. Please subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. We will talk to you next time.